So this is a conversation of, with 5 people on the subject of free speech and hate speech. It was presented in the program as free speech versus hate speech, but I would rather just say free speech and hate speech, so that we are not immediately thrown into that, the antagonism, the extremes of us and them, and etc. I think before I go to the sort of formal description of the panel, I would actually like to ask each of the panelists for their quick thoughts on what we have just heard, especially from Zina, about well, the reality of her life, the challenge, and whether or not it's all worthwhile, the question of doing it, what it is that we do, and also her final statement about the right to offend does not exist. Masha, I wonder if I could just ask for your reflections.
Well, put me on
just
the spot.
informal. No, I mean, we're all thinking about what we just heard, so let's just, you know.
Yeah, it's a familiar dilemma for me, and obviously when I listen to a talk like that, I think about choices that I've made, that people I know have made. I think my immediate reaction is sort of, it's an unquestioned good to be able to live and write free of those choices. And I'm really sort of weary of romanticizing the danger that is inherent, too often inherent, in what really should just be a day's work for a writer.
So, I'm sorry, I should have introduced Masha Gessen, to whom you've already been introduced, Russian-American writer and activist. Frankie, Asare-Donkoh, who's a journalist, a political scientist, the president of Ghana PEN. What was your kind of reflection on what you just heard from Zina?
Well, I think there's always a price to be paid to live. And those of us living in Africa, we see it every day, especially being a journalist and a writer. Because as we heard from the UK, states have obligation to promote freedom of expression. But do they do it? In Africa, you can't find states promoting that. And as a journalist or a writer, you are always faced with either you abandon the profession or you put your life at that danger for society to be able to express itself. So it's really touching what happened, but it is not surprising because these things have gone on for ages. And I believe it will still continue until we combine to fight the system.
Kamal Khan is a Pakistani human rights activist, currently in Germany. Kamal, how would you respond to what you just heard from Zina?
I think standing with humanitarian values is very difficult in Pakistani context because there is blasphemy law exists, and recently our human rights defender who was supporting a blasphemy accused person, he was also murdered. But we have to speak about those issues, and we have to talk about the freedom of expression, and we have right what we think. So I definitely agree with her in her arguments.
And the Libyan poet, Dr. Ashur Etwebi, who's from Libya, now living in Norway. What are your reflections on Zina's comments?
It's a quite complicated issue, and what Zainab revealed is only one facet. It's a multifaceted issue. And I want to ask this question. Why, after the fall down of the dictators, this huge surge of fanatics of IS? I mean, where it was hidden, under which layer of the society, under which layer of thinking, of narrative? I mean, I think this is the question that we should, and I think it will take a long time to answer that.
Larry, Siems. editor, poet, American, and American.
And morality. I guess having been introduced that way, I should probably just comment a bit on that idea of safe spaces and right not to be offended. I mean, it is actually interesting that that phenomenon in the United States has gotten such international attention. I think disproportionate to the power of that argument in the United States. Maybe not. But I do think, while we don't talk about the right not to be offended as a human right, I think we talk about the right to coexist as a positive cultural value, and one that exists quite strongly in the United States. I think it was interesting, I was in Denmark right after the killings in Denmark, and I was interviewed a number of times about how I felt about these things. And all of the interviewers in Denmark knew what my answer would be before I knew it. And they essentially knew that I would be, in some ways, more in favor of voluntary restraint than they were, because I'm an American. And I think there is something in the American cultural tradition, especially when it comes to religious speech. After all, we're a country that's founded by religious fanatics of a number of variety of stripes. There is a sense that there's, sometimes not offending is not the same thing as self-censoring, I suppose. And so, the safe space argument is quite absurd in many ways, and it's kind of the American experience twisted to a distorted level. But I do think that, to say that we don't have a fundamental human right not to be offended is to kind of turn upside down what is actually a quite positive thing, which is that we do have a right as human beings to try to treat each other with respect and dignity.
Can I just add something to that? I mean, this strikes me as a fundamentally false question. And it's a little odd to me that we're falling into it because I understand where it comes from in the conversation about Charlie Hebdo, but the right, let's suppose for a second that we have a fundamental human right not to be offended. Would the violation of that right be punishable by death? No. So can we just take that question off the table, please? It has nothing to do with what we're talking about. It's a false dichotomy.
So some of the questions I'd like us to address in the time that we have are, again, to come back to this idea of resisting and countering the inflamed narrative which we are forced towards of the clash of civilization. And we're forced towards that by terrorist acts, by the rhetoric of governments, even into this position of being for or against, with us, against us. And that forms the kind of debate that we find ourselves in. And so we're always having to defend one way or the other, extreme positions. The other thing I wanted to ask was, and this is something that Larry started to address, of whether the tempering of freedom of speech or of free speech is a form of self-censorship. And a question, does the protection of the right to offend cause irreparable offense? For PEN members, we find ourselves constantly required by our charter to address this question of balance between what could appear to be competing rights or competing ideas, one of which is absolutely to oppose any form of suppression of freedom of expression in the country and community in which we live, as well as throughout the world. But we also commit to do our utmost to dispel race, class, and national hatreds. So there is this kind of tension in our charter, by which I would suggest as a PEN member, we should measure our response and consider our actions. I think that our charter obliges us to do that. And the other context for all of this is that in this world that we all live in, this globalized 24/7 world, there's no such thing as a localized context. Every single thing we do becomes instantly available, commented upon, exploited, and used elsewhere in the world. Hostilities and recriminations are exacerbated in the hotbed of the internet. There's the accelerated assault on the rights of targeted groups of people when legislation in one country almost immediately becomes mirrored elsewhere in the world. There are all these things conspiring against the kind of balanced careful, compassionate, but still very strong commitment to the things that we believe in and exercising those commitments. So I wanted to ask the panel to start with, just in terms of that idea that we are here in this place, I'm wondering what for you is, we've talked about the description of the conference, this stories from the edge of freedom. I'm wondering what for you is meant by, what means that term, the edge of freedom? What is for you, the tension or the balance or the conflict of, let's say, competing rights or competing desires or etc.? Kamal, can I start with you this time? Actually, you don't have to always start, just because you...
Yeah, actually, where I belong to the country in Pakistan, like, if we talk about the freedom of expression last month, about academic freedoms also, if I mention. So there was a debate was tabled in a prestigious university, but after intervention of the country's secret service, it was cancelled, and in 24th of April, the program was rescheduled, and in another venue in Karachi, and our prominent human rights defender, Sabine Mahmood, eventually she got killed by unknown people. And so we are getting such kind of reactions for the paying what we're standing for, freedom of expression and academic freedoms. So our societies, also in Pakistani society, the people are in some religious groups, they are defining their own religion issues with freedom of expression, and the state itself with fundamental policies with supporting extremists. In this particular freedom of speech case, it's completely different behavior the state is adopting. So for me, in Pakistani context, there are some issues, there are some assignments for human rights defenders and for the journalists which are very much deadly and which cannot be touched if we talk about the freedom of expression and these kind of values.
Well, you see, I think we have to stress the important role of the writer or the journalist. And if you look at the series of military interventions in Africa, the journalists or the media have always been the first casualty, because they know that they will speak the mind of the people. So first they will try to win you. Once that fails, then they have to try to eliminate it. So it means the journalist becomes an endangered species, so to speak. In that case, there's always the need for the journalists also to find out how to go about their duties. In some places, there are, in the last 10, 15 years, where many of the countries are going so-called democracy. There are laws, but now they are using several other means, where military will come in. Sometimes they will just pick you up, nobody hears about you. And it takes quite a long time. Particularly in Ghana, for 11 years under military rule, people just got missing, media houses were closed, you'll be there and some people just attack you. And where do you go to report? Because the police are the same people who came to arrest you. They came to pick you, no warrant. So it becomes so dangerous. But that doesn't mean that we have to leave them to have their way. So definitely we also have to find a way of going about the issues. And particularly coming from Africa, there are a few journalists who are given the chance for people to attack the media as a whole. Because sometimes, because we've been suppressed for a long time, we get the freedom, and then we also leave the responsibility. Because there was a journalist in Ghana who wrote, use or instead of some. under Royce, and he has to be tried and sentenced. We fought for him from pen, not because what he did was right, what he did was wrong. But our challenge was, why do you try him under criminal contempt instead of civil contempt? But we know that he was a senior journalist. He would have been more responsible to check that it was not all the members of that previous government who were settled, but some. And he knew this. But just one word, it took us a lot of time running around, mobilizing support. When he was jailed, we had to visit him in prison all the time. So what I also think is that whilst we campaign for freedom, we also need to intensify our education so that writers and journalists, they know which environment they live in. There are laws. Some people say that my freedom will end where your nose starts. So we need to be able to balance this freedom with responsibility. Otherwise, we will not be able to free the space for people to express themselves.
I guess, just speaking, I guess, from my experience where I live in the world and thinking a little bit about what David said about, let's look really specifically at censorship. If you say the edge that we're talking about, on the other side of the edge is what's censored. I suppose in the United States, you would say that over the edge is, a lot of the kind of national security terrain that we've talked about. So you're talking about, let's begin with Guantanamo, secret spaces, or beyond that, even a network of secret prisons that have been set up, but places where the people in there, we never hear their voices, not only the prisoners, but also the men and women who work there. I guess beyond that, now we have an international targeted killing program. Decisions of life and death are made from the United States, according to target lists that are approved by a very small group of people, without any chance to challenge whether you're on the list. We have Edward Snowden, who's living in Moscow, for revealing matters that he considered to be of urgent public concern, where he's warning us that the edge of freedom of expression is actually very close to us, because we're all being monitored by our government, and it's right here. And I think that is, should be quite alarming to those of us in the West, because that's exactly the message that he's trying to deliver. He's saying that, these lines are moving very close to us and they're moving inside of us in a way. So that's something I wonder about a lot. I mean, we're making a great deal of noise about whether we can say a very specific and narrow band of things, and we should be thinking about that. These are, the big discussion we had before. These are really important questions. But in my country, I think I'm curious that, we're not making nearly so much noise about some of these other outrages, these other censored spaces that our government is guarding quite resolutely. And I guess, the question for me is to what extent that's a question of complicity and to what extent it's a question of self-censorship and all of those things. But I think that's, from where I sit in my part of the world, that's where the boundaries are. They're the ones where, beyond these places, my government is maintaining a great deal of information that we don't have access to.
Personally, I would prefer my freedom to be without edges. But I know that, in fact, in reality, that my freedom will intersect with others. And what makes trouble is that intersection between my freedom and others. So I would prefer to go for freedom to do things rather than freedom to express. This doesn't mean that there is no importance of a freedom of expression. I want to go further, freedom to do. And I think in my view that this will, if we think in this way, I think we will have more solid actions, solid projects, solid, you name it, that can attract others. Just keeping it in the corner of a freedom of expression alone, that doesn't go to the other freedom to do, makes that edge.
So So both you two seem to be suggesting in some way that we're not having the right debate, and you were saying this too earlier, and we're not asking the right questions, and we're being forced to have a debate that cuts off some really important issues. The issue that you raised, the very, very important issue, we're not talking about that. Instead, we're talking on a sort of more superficial level, or we're being forced into these extremes. Instead of looking at the really, really deep problems, we're not discussing the deep problems, we're only discussing the kind of superficial manifestation of those problems. So, I don't know if that's fair or not. Ashur, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I would actually pick up on that. I mean, I think that the depth of the discussion and in fact is an indicator of the quality of public space. And I think that the tension, for example, you were describing in the Penn Charter is a sort of luxury of democracy. I mean, Penn is a democratic organization in which you have those tensions being, it's an edge that is being negotiated constantly. That's what it's supposed to look like. What it's not supposed to look like is like a hard edge, which is what you get in the absence of public space. And I think that one thing that I'm really thinking about hard lately is that when you have a country like Russia, and like many countries around the world, actually like most countries around the world, where public space is either absent or being systematically suppressed and destroyed, you get substitutes for public space that can look briefly very good, like social networks can look really good as substitutes for public space, until you realize that these are privately owned companies. They're not actually public space, and so what you get, for example, is what we have in Russia right now, and this has just been developing over the last couple of weeks, is Facebook under pressure from Kremlin trolls and from the government itself, shutting down opposition bloggers. And there are no laws protecting opposition bloggers on Facebook because it is not part of public space. It may be an American-owned company, but it's a private company and can do whatever it wants. It can block whoever it wants. And I think that looking at those substitutes and looking at the quality of public space is really important. And even as I was taking notes about that and thinking about how important it is to think about the negotiable space, I was again reminded that the hard edge is also a very real thing. I mean, just as we were coming into this room, I got news from Moscow that a political commentator named Vladimir Karamurza, who's 34 years old, is in a coma in a Moscow hospital after being rushed from his workplace after losing conscience. It may be some sort of freak illness, but it looks very much like another one in a long line of poisonings. This is somebody who works with Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He's an organizer of public seminars and a political commentator who works with the Russia Foundation. That's what the hard edge of freedom really looks like.
I'd like to ask this. I don't know whether we sometimes ask ourselves, how much do we pay for freedom of expression? Because in societies where it is almost granted that it exists, you can speak whatever you want to do, say, and then nothing happens. In other societies, there's always a price. Because I remember President Museveni of Uganda once was saying that he can guarantee you the freedom of expression, but he can't guarantee you what happens after that freedom. And it is a common practice in Africa. So mostly we always look at, yes, I want to do this story, I want to expose this. Am I ready to pay the price? And so I think that there's always the need for networking and support, where after the exercise of that freedom, the price could be jointly also paid. So I think we need to also bring that to as to how much are we prepared and how far can we go to have that freedom and how much are we prepared to pay.
I was just thinking about this issue that you suggest about negotiating the public space and whether or not it is a real public space. But I'm wondering about in countries like Libya, for example, like Ghana, like Pakistan, and you were referring earlier to the kind of conflicts, the complications of religious conflicts. How is it emerging, let's say in Ghana, for example, expressions of the kind of exacerbated religious hostilities that we see elsewhere in the world, where the Muslim population, for example, is very small? How does that manifest itself? What is the public dialogue like on issues like that? And what is the public dialogue on issues like LGBT issues? I mean, how do those things, how are they discussed? How is the relationship created between possibly opposing ideas?
Yeah, as far as issues about religion is concerned, since 2001, when the law on criminal defamation was repealed, we've not had any serious issue about those issues. But there are still some laws in our books that are applied. And last 2 years, when after the elections there was a petition, the Supreme Court jailed some journalists, and that was contempt of court. And some of us were saying that, well, you can't be the player and the referee at the same time. So we spoke against it. So those laws are still there, which we try to fight. But generally, about religion, I believe there's also a kind of self-censorship as far as Ghana is concerned. Because if I'm a Christian and I'm writing about issues about Islam, there's a bit of a caution. And then most of the editors from previous systems are also a bit cautious. But there's a very, very cordial relationship between the Christian community and the Muslim community. So that also helps. But besides that, the state is using the courts. Because once it gets a court, and the newspaper was just about to start, it's fined so huge an amount. That's the end. So those things are still there. But in terms of religion, we don't have much of that, because the difference between the Muslim and the Christian issues haven't gotten to the stage where you write something about this religion and then there will be attention. Sometimes you see them coming. And there was a time a journalist wrote about a conflict between two ethnic groups in the north. And some of us thought that story shouldn't have been reported, because it was said that one ethnic group decided to kill the other one from another ethnic group. And before the news was even finished, the two ethnic groups have already engaged themselves. So in such cases, you need to be a bit cautious as to see, would this story bring this conflict? Or is it good to leave it and then maybe deal with it in a better way? So sometimes it's a bit of a discretion. And we think that the laws that we face now, even though we've dealt with the criminal contempt, the state, the government, is using the civil libel. And sometimes we're able to determine the outcome of a case when you know which judge is handling the case. So that's the danger that we have now.
We had the same case like in Pakistan. Suppose the journalists are in a hostile situation. I remember 2 years ago, the government passed a different type of order. They said you don't have to give any coverage to banned outfits, to banned militant organizations. So the journalists, they sat together and they decided the government is going to jail us, but the militants are the extremist organizations, they are going to kill us. So it's better to get jailed than killed. So finally they said that we are going to provide the coverage to the even bad outfits. So the journalists, they are covering some sensitive issues in Pakistan, so they are in the same position. Recently, last month, Pakistan also is preparing for a internet strict law. They are working on this internet strict law, and there any authority according to this law, any authority can block and access of any website and anything, any content which they think according to their interpretation, it's against the state integrity or against the state security. So the journalists are in complete hostile in Pakistan between the extremists and the states.
Ashur, a thought. I also wanted to ask you what it was that finally took you out of Libya, what it was that meant you had to leave.
Well, let me tell a very short story that shows what I want to the answer. In 1994, I was asked to help in establishing a faculty of medicine, school of medicine in the city of Sirte, which is a coastal city in the middle of Libya. And the society there is very conservative. And in the first year, it's hardly, when I go to the downtown, hardly I could see a woman or a girl walking. 6 years later, I was with my family, swimming, and surrounded by many girls, women, men swimming. So the university did that. After the 17th of February and the power struggle and the Muslim Brotherhood took center stage, taking care of the extremist factions, providing them with money and military equipment and arms, etc., while the civilians and the seculars were busy organizing NGOs, establishing newspapers, etc. Those were working very hard. And then, in that city, where I was swimming surrounded by beautiful girls and women, now the university is closed. Women are with burqa, etc., and people are beheaded. And just last month, 5 journalists were beheaded. The last 24 hours, 5 people were killed. So I think there is an element of power struggle, and certain Muslim parties, Muslim organizations are trying to take the power, and they are making these things. And I think the Western countries, the Western civilized countries, Europe, America should stop helping them. It's very important for the Libyan people, for the Tunisians, for the Egyptians, for the Yemenis, for the Syrians, for the Iraqis, that those, what they call in the Western media as moderate Muslims, should stop their support to them. And from that, and don't even help the seculars or the civilians, or just let them struggle. Once the help from outside is stopped, I think we will see a turning point in the politics and power struggle in that region.
I didn't answer this question.
you can answer the question, yes. You
No,
did.
no, I didn't answer your questions deliberately because why I was forced to flee my country, it is not that issue. The issue is bigger than that.
How much time do we have?
Eight minutes more?
8 minutes. It's given us 8 minutes. So I'd like to have some questions from the floor. I'd like to recognize the ambassador. I think you wanted to say something. Did you want to have a comment at this point? Microphone here, sir. And I'd ask you to, if you're speaking, to identify yourself and your center.
Now, what I see is on my trips and visiting countries, this is hate speech versus free speech, freedom of expression, is a big issue, and it's being debated everywhere. And I think we can go on for a long time, and I don't think we ever say come out of it. But what is very important, that we always say be discussing this. Yeah, and as Masha said as well, I mean, it's not something to take, say, the weapons and to kill people. It should be discussed. And I had a wonderful discussion also in Pakistan with some lawyers, and it was really on, what can you do and what can't you do. And this was also about Charlie Hebdo on one hand and Dieudonné, who criticized or who made fun out of the Holocaust on the other hand. And then respected Pakistan lawyer, she said, well, there's one thing of criticizing a religion, which is an opinion of someone, and on the other hand, of making fun of, the suffering of which has undergone by a whole people as such. And these kinds of debates, they should continue in a society, and that's also what makes a society say, that is what you need to have in society. And then I get to the weapons, of course. Thanks.
Well, I have a similar comment. Nadeja Tocino is from Croatia.
And freedom of expression is also a social thing. It's about public space. It's not a private thing. It's about the right to address other people. I mean, it's always an activity for someone. And this activity means sometimes that you offend or whatever you do, because it's always an action. Freedom of speech. It's not a private, it's the Gedanken sind frei, that is, you can think whatever it is, but freedom of expression means that we want to have a public space where we do that. Of course, tolerance, on the other hand, means that we are exempting some things from this kind of debate. We agree to disagree, but we don't our access to public life must be dependent on our whatever sex or religion or whatever. But that's a different kind of issue. Freedom of expression is always about addressing the other. It's not self-reference. So there are dangers. You can't avoid the dangers in this kind of thing.
Hi, my name is Gessen. I just want to comment about the freedom of expression in the region of the Middle East. It's become kind of culture. If we going to really think about not to offend the others, in the Middle East we have to be silent. Like 200 million people have to speak nothing. If I say to my dad, there is a culture of accumulated oppression in the region. Culture, I cannot speak in a loud voice to my dad. I have to respect my older brother, and the wife has to respect her husband, and the younger brother has to oversee his older sister and stuff. So whatever we say in the region, we offend somebody. So the only thing that we have to speak in the region, we have to say whatever we believe in, except we call for violence. We have to establish this culture, and I sometimes feel strange that some writers say, or activists, we do have to be careful not to offend Muslims. But whatever you say, you offend Muslim. If you don't say Assalamu alaikum, where I came from, Syria, in my region, we don't use Assalamu alaikum. But I was in Tunisia working, and somebody said Assalamu alaikum, and I said Marhaba, which means hello. And I had big fight, which is And I had to explain the literal meaning of Assalamu alaikum, which means peace upon you. And he was shouting at me, screaming at me, because I didn't say Assalamu alaikum salam. I said marhaba, which means hello. And this is where I come from, this is my culture. So we need to expand it. We need to speak in the region, and we have to offend, because if we don't offend, I mean peacefully, if we don't offend, we can't speak. There is terrible layers of oppression, and we have to penetrate these layers bit by bit, or we have to write or do something. So there is nothing called offending. Thank you.
Can I just say that I do feel a little bit like we're being presented with like you said, a kind of a false choice here. I mean, I don't think, the sense that somehow we have to pull back an offense, or and give more respect or something like that. To me, it's just a more situation, right? I don't think you yield the space that comes with a freedom to offend. But I do think that, we just heard some very, very strong statements about, how it looks from Libya in terms of global manipulation and influence on the fate of the Libyan people. And these are not views that get heard in the United States, And I think so, I think to focus only on the question of to what extent we can offend people is kind of taking our eyes off the fact that, again, there are major, issues and emotions and policy questions that are not getting debated in the public space, and I think we're getting, we're like moving and, concentrating on this one, very contested area, and there's so much more, that's driving this, I think if there was, it's a very simple formulation. If there was a greater sense of recognition and respect, there would be less likelihood of feeling offense. It just seems like a very typical human reaction, right? If you feel recognized and heard, you're not going to take things as offensive, as if you feel completely disempowered. And so I think that's, to me, I think that's really important to, I think we all agree that the space to offend is important, space that we all are dedicated to protecting. I'd like to see the space grown for, another kind of offensive speech, which is the speech that really kind of offends the power structures that we're talking about. Actually, can I do one thing? Because when you asked me to do this panel, I was so freaked out because I thought, I don't know, I have no opinion on these subjects because it changes every hour. Honestly, my opinion on this subject, you ask me tomorrow what I think, and I'm going to give you a totally different answer. And then I remembered the words of my favorite poet, and I think they're really great, and it's Walt Whitman. And Walt Whitman says, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes."
Thank you all very much for being part of this discussion. It's greatly appreciated. That's important. Thank you. Thank you.